in medicine, we have what is really a last mile problem. Now, it's not really the same last mile problem that we hear about in tech or delivery all the time. It's the last mile problem of we have incredible ideas and incredible theory about how the human body works and about medicine. But to get it to the patient where and when we need it, it has to go through the last mile of a small group team. Now, that team could be ER doctors and trauma folks in the middle of a resuscitation, or OB-GYN folks and neonatologists working together. Whatever it is, it's a small group team that has to come together under uncertainty, take all of this knowledge we've gained and somehow apply it to the person where and when they need it. And that problem is the one that I love the most. How do we apply knowledge under pressure, specifically as a small group team?
And now, from San Francisco and the UCSF Rosenman Institute, the Health Technology Podcast with your host, Christine Winoto.
Imagine this. A patient arrives in the ER, their life hanging in the balance. The clock is ticking and the pressure is overwhelming. But here's the thing. It's not just about having the right knowledge or tools. It's about how a team, often strangers to each other, can come together in seconds to deliver the right care at the right moment. This last mile problem, getting critical care to the patient when and where it is needed, is one of the most urgent challenges in healthcare. This is where Dr. Dan Dworkis comes in. Dan is an emergency physician, researcher, and the Chief Medical Officer of the Mission Critical Teams Institute. With a background in molecular medicine and emergency care, Dan has spent his career studying how individuals and teams perform under pressure. His work is not just about saving lives in the ER. It's about understanding the science of stress, resilience, and teamwork, and applying those lessons to high-stakes environments everywhere. Dan's journey started with a love of science and technology, but it was in the emergency department where he found his calling. There, he saw how systemic issues like access to care, poverty, and social inequities intersected with medicine. But what really grabbed his attention was the art of performance under pressure, how people and teams rise to the occasion in the most demanding moments. Through his work at the Mission Critical Teams Institute, Dan has collaborated with organizations like NASA, fire departments, and space programs to rethink how teams prepare for and respond to crisis. His insights are helping reshape how we think about stress, teamwork, and delivering results when it matters most. In this episode, Dan shares how he's redefining what it means to perform under pressure. We talk about the myths surrounding stress, the importance of self-awareness, and how teams can train to thrive in the most demanding situations. Whether you're in healthcare, business, or any field where the stakes are high, Dan's insight will give you a fresh perspective on how to navigate uncertainty and deliver when it matters most. This is a conversation about resilience, innovation, and the power of preparation. And here's our conversation. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you. And I always like to start with our guest journey because I think everybody has a good story, what the path that they took and not take. And people who inspired them to get to where they are today. So I'd like you to share about your story a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that you asked that, right? The paths you take and the paths that you don't take, because I think you do have to sort of look at them as an ensemble and figure it out. And everything always makes sense or makes more sense looking at it backwards. And the lived experience of going forward with it is really quite different. So, I went into medicine initially thinking that I was going to maybe build medical devices. I loved the engineering and the science side of it, and thought that the MD PhD program would be a really interesting way to sort of marry those aspects, right? Like, what does the basic science tell us? How do we incorporate that? And devices and technology really seemed like it was the thing I wanted to do. And then I got in there and started to, and I was part of an amazing MD PhD program at Boston University and Boston Medical. And they were really clear at the beginning of it that your job as an MD PhD is to develop multiple sets of lenses to view the world, right? View the world as a scientist, view the world as a physician, and to switch back and forth between lenses and try to see problems in different ways than other people could because of your different training sets. So it was really multidisciplinary from the very beginning. And I got in there and, you start to see that a lot of what the people that we were treating were suffering from wouldn't necessarily be fixed by new technology. Now, technology is wonderful and I love it, right? But a lot of the problems were, say, social problems or systems problems or problems that were related to access and poverty and health-related effects of that. And where this became just really clear for me was in the emergency department, right? Because you'd go and you'd see in the emergency department, you'd see the most complicated illnesses, but you'd also see the people that were stabbed or shot because of, violence in Boston at the time, people that were unhoused or suffering from poverty and didn't have enough food to eat or just needed a pair of socks on a cold winter day or something. And you see all of this suffering that happens because of that. And I think I really fell in love with the emergency department at that space in Boston Medical because these were folks that always said yes. Were you stabbed? Do you need a sandwich? Whatever it is, we're going to say yes and try to make your life better. And I loved that ethos of it. Trained in emergency medicine, and then really made a bit of a pivot in there and became incredibly fascinated by this idea of how do we apply knowledge under pressure, right? Because I think to go, okay, I'm going to do my sales pitch here for a second, all right? I'm going to stay on the soapbox, and I promise I'll get off in a second, but this is my real soapbox, which is that in medicine, we have what is really a last mile problem. Right now, it's not really the same last mile problem that we hear about in tech or delivery all the time. It's the last mile problem of we have incredible ideas and incredible theory about how the human body works and about medicine. But to get it to the patient where and when we need it, it has to go through the last mile of a small group team. Now, that team could be ER doctors and trauma folks in the middle of a resuscitation or OB-GYN folks and neonatologists working together. Whatever it is, it's a small group team that has to come together under uncertainty, take all of this knowledge we've gained and somehow apply it to the person where and when they need it. And that problem is the one that I love the most. How do we apply knowledge under pressure, specifically as a small group team? And that's where I end up spending most of my time today is trying to figure out what do we know about how to solve that problem.
That's exactly what I think we do want to talk about today. It's like how to solve a problem, a critical problem. When it's critical, oftentimes it's a very stressful time. And oftentimes, at least my understanding, when you're stressed out, sometimes your brain is not fully function. And how do you solve that problem in that moment? That's what we want to learn from you. Is there like a framework that you learn from all this exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of interesting ways to take that, right? So I guess let me start by laying a piece of groundwork, which I think is really crucially important. And it's that, do you fundamentally believe that performing under pressure, that applying knowledge under pressure, is it a character trait that you either have or you don't? Or is it a skill that you can learn like any other skill? I think it's really important to drill on this because often in or out of medicine, we're fed some dominant myths about how do you perform under pressure, right? And one of those myths is that you're either born with it or you're not. You're either good at pressure or you're bad at pressure. And I think that is fundamentally not true. Now, sure, there are components, right? Some people are better or worse at certain skill sets than others. But in general, in my mind, performing under pressure is a skill, and it's a skill that you or anyone can learn. And I think it's so important to say that out loud, especially if you're listening to this and you're early in the training pipeline and you're wondering, man, I don't know if I have what it takes to do this. No, you can learn it, right? As an ER doctor, I have delivered a number of babies, not a large number, but a number, right? And between myself, my friends who are ER doctors, all of our friends who are OB-GYNs, anybody that I've talked to about this, I've never seen anybody deliver a baby that's a fully formed trauma surgeon, right? It doesn't work like that. Everybody's born, and then at some point they grow into having what it takes in order to perform under pressure. So if that's true, then that means that's also true for you. If you're listening to this, you can perform under pressure. It's a skill. So I think that's a really fundamental building block to start with, right?
It's a skill that you can learn.
Mm-hmm.
And also sometimes I almost wonder, people decide they want to go that route is because that is something, an environment that they enjoy to be in or thrive in the environment too. And that kind of help you train yourself to be better at it.
Absolutely, right? It's something, now it certainly is something you might enjoy more or less as a human being. And there's no requirement that everybody in medicine has to be an ER doctor or a surgeon or whatever, right? We need an enormous number of people doing an enormous number of styles of work to make medicine happen. So there's no requirement that you have to, but it's important that I think you know from the beginning that you could do this, that anybody can learn how to do this. I think that's really crucial.
Do you think, I mean, I've heard all this from anecdotal stories, and also when I was working in finance, is that oftentimes your supervisor will start yelling at you and put you in that pressure, and then eventually you learn how to kind of stay calm. And is that conducive, or is that something that actually is not helpful?
Yeah, great question, right? Because I think that's sort of, if the first myth is that performance under pressure is a character trait, I think the second myth is that you get better under pressure as an accident of being put under pressure, right? You get better under pressure just by doing the thing over and over again. And if that was true, right, if all it took to get better was, getting beat up over and over again, essentially, then the oldest people in the room would always be the best at this because they would have had the most time on target. And we know that's not true, right? Sometimes there are folks who are further along in their career that are incredible at this. They're amazing role models. Other times there are folks that are further along in their career and they are not incredible at this. They still crumble or they yell or other things happen and they just don't behave like we want them to. So if the answer to the first one is you can train to be better under pressure, the answer from my mind to the second one is time on target is necessary, but not sufficient to get better under pressure. Okay, it's not enough just to show up and get yelled at. You have to actively train it, just like you would train any other skill, right? We don't expect you to learn how to put a central line in or microbiology or how to run a model for finance just by sitting in the same room as other people and having them yell at you, right? We train you how to do it, right? So there's no reason that that's any different than the skill of performing under pressure. Now, there's a subtle hitch to that, which is your question of, sort of how should we train people to perform under pressure and how much pressure should we put them under when we do it? And that's a pretty active area for debate, right? I think there's some evidence from the simulational world that we're starting to get at to what happens when you put people in a simulation that's designed to be low stress, very easy, where you're sort of practicing a technique, and a different type of simulation where it's high stress, high fidelity, there's yelling, there's screaming, there's, fake blood going everywhere. And what are you learning from each of those realms? And the shortcut answer, without getting into that hugely, is just that those are each tools in a toolbox and you should use them for the right thing, right? So you should use them when it's the appropriate thing to train stress or when it's the appropriate thing to train technique. And then sometimes a little bit together, but often separate like that.
So in order to thrive and be successful in a stressful and critical time to solve a problem, how do you prepare to get there? Like, what are the steps?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways to look at it. One that I tend to like a lot is looking at first internally, managing yourself, right? How do you manage the stress of what's going on? And then abstracting out and looking at teams. How do teams manage performance under pressure? And then you can even do sort of one layer above that and look at systems, right? How do the systems prepare the space for teams to perform? How do the teams help the individuals on the team perform? And you can sort of look at these different levels of abstraction. So when I think about individuals, when I think about how do I perform under pressure or how does another individual perform under pressure, and I think this is true if you're talking about the pressure of medicine or the pressure of finance or industry or fire or military or whatever, we know that most humans tend to have this relationship between performance and stress that's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? So the Yerkes-Dodson curve is a bell-shaped distribution between performance and stress. And it basically says that for any person, there's an optimal amount of stress at which they perform their best. And then if you underload them, if you give them not enough stress, they don't perform quite as well. And if you overload them, you give them too much stress, they also don't perform quite as well. Everybody has this optimal. And the intuition here, you could imagine, is a guitar string or a violin string. If the string is too tight, it breaks. And if it's too loose, it flops around and it doesn't make good music. You have to tune it just right to get the note you want out of it. Right? So just knowing that, and this was originally derived from experiments on rats, which, at various points in my medical career felt like it was directly applicable to me or not. But, whatever, it works for people too. And I think you can just, intuitively understand that seems to model most people's experiences with stress and pressure. But if you know there's this bell-shaped distribution, then the first thing you can do is swap out your language for how you talk about stress. Okay, so if you are overloaded with stress and your performance is suffering, there's this tendency to say, wow, I'm really screwing up, right? I am really bad. My performance is just awful right now. And you see, especially in junior trainees, a bit of a death spiral that happens here. My performance is terrible. Wow, I'm really failing. That must mean I'm terrible. I'm a terrible doctor. I'm never going to make it. My mom hates me. I should just, and it just sort of just like falls off the cliff. So instead, you can swap that out and say, I am right shifted. I'm right shifted. I'm on the Yerkes-Dodson curve and I'm right of where I want to be. I'm on the too much stress side. That's okay. All humans are wired like that. All I have to do is figure out how to left shift back to center. And having that language that allows you to talk to yourself about it, your teammates about it, that as instructors, we should be talking to our trainees about it like that, gives us a frame that we can use that takes it away from I'm a horrible person and puts it in the realm of this is how human brains operate. Let's get back to work. Mm-hmm. So I think that's like the really base level building block that we have to put in first.
Do you think it sounds like what I hear from you is almost like, okay, this is where I am. This is the problem that I'm having, which is maybe I'm a bit overwhelmed, and then solving that particular problem instead of saying that I'm a bad person. I mean, I'm not good enough. That is not solving a problem. It's more like the feeling that you have right now, rather than looking at it, detach yourself from what you feel, but just put it in front of you and solve that problem.
Yeah, and a lot of the art of that, a lot of the practice of that is learning to identify the signals in yourself that help you figure out where you are on that curve of performance versus pressure, right? So, we can think in medicine, we talk about the word proprioception, the sense of where our body is in space. And here we can use the word introception, our internal radar of what's happening inside of us. Right. So, and you can train that. And it's pretty easy to start. You can, you pause this recording after a second and think about this yourself, but you can basically say, all right, last time I was really right shifted. I was way off the curve and my performance was suffering. What did it feel like inside me? Right. What was going on? What might tell me that that's where I am? And we know some general stuff about how the human brain and human body works under high amounts of stress and pressure, right? We know we have, for example, peripheral neglect, where most of us will hyper-focus visually on something in front of us and ignore the periphery of our field of vision. We know we get sweaty and have increased heart rate and change our energy state like this as our sympathetic drive fires up. That's pretty average that most humans will do that in high stakes scenarios. But internally for you in particular, it's a little harder to say what it feels like. So that's where the interoceptive skill comes in. You might say, I get this tightness in my chest and my back when I'm stressed. And another person might say, I actually find myself speaking in an accent that I had when I was growing up as opposed to how I normally speak now, or my thoughts feel slower or faster or whatever it is. And the more you're able to identify those signals, the easier you are to position yourself on that curve and then start to, in your words, Christine, start to solve that problem, right?
Mm-hmm. When you're saying about as a skill that is trainable, in that way, the curve is, because when you give the analogy about violin, there's one perfect string tension. But when a human is almost, that's something that can be adjusted
Yeah.
as you train yourself.
Right. So I'm going to start this metaphor by saying I don't play the violin. So I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here. And I think this is how this probably works, which is that maybe the metaphor we're saying here is when you just start, you accept the violin however it's tuned and built, and you try to play it. When you're getting better at it, you're easily able to say, hey, this string is a little off. Let me retune it and I'll get a better note out of it. Right. So you can recognize in yourself, I'm not behaving the way I want to. Let me do some things to modify myself and my environment such that I'm more likely to succeed at this. And then there's sort of like a meta abstract level is can you change the way the violin is shaped, or can you make a really good violin that holds its tune and stuff like that? So it's sort of like the expansion to the metaphor. But really what we're talking about here is the discipline of understanding what's going on in yourself, recognizing those signals of stress, and then deploying countermeasures as a person and as a team that allow you to sit in that pocket of uncertainty better, longer, and make better decisions while you're in it.
Mm-hmm. In oftentimes, when you're always already stressed out, the last thing you think about is all this process in your head. What tools do you advise for people to kind of practice this before they got stressed out?
Yeah, exactly.
And remember about whatever that they practice when they're facing that stressful situation.
So you could imagine, so one of the models we use for this is called the wedge model, right? And you can imagine like a wedge, like a doorstop or something quite simple like that. And high wedge is your life and death scenarios, right? It is trauma in the bay and you're up to run it. If you're, my friend who's an entrepreneur, you imagine they have a finance error and they realize they're going to run out of cash immediately and their company is going to crash. Or you're facing a fight, whatever it is. This is full bore, full stakes kind of scenario. Low wedge would be a model of that scenario where the impact and intensity are turned down. All right. So if you're in business, a low wedge might be running a case study or running a simulation. If you're in medicine and you're trying to train to intubate somebody, a low wedge scenario might be running it on a mannequin or running it with a more senior provider next to you where you can sort of talk it through with them. So the first piece of advice is whenever possible, if you know what high wedge is going to look like, go out and find low wedge ways to practice it, right? Build a system that allows you to become familiar with that space and that feeling before you have to use it in real life, right? And we can talk, if you're interested about, if you want to go this way, about the cognitive load theory, about why that might actually help you. But even ignoring that for a second, just if you can find low wedge spaces to practice, that's super important. Right. So then the other thing that I'd add into that is, can you plant flags that help you get back on course if you drift off? Right. So you might choose, for example, you might sit down and say, okay, when I'm right shifted, and I'll know that because I feel X, I'm going to do Y to help myself get back into center. And that might be a phrase or an anchor movement, some physical action you do with your body to help get you back to center. You see athletes do this a lot, right? They dribble in a certain way before they shoot a free throw. They might say a mantra to themselves before they go out on the court or the field. And they do that because it helps them remember all of the commitments they've made ahead of time about how they want to perform. And it helps them get in the best frame of mind they can to bring into it.
Yeah, it's I wish I knew that about the mantra that athletes does. And I only learned that maybe about 4 years ago. I was like, oh, I did not know. So the power of your mind and the word, the intentionality when you do that. And if only they kind of teach that more in the regular setting.
So I'll throw one out there. So if you're just hearing about this for the first time, I'll throw one out that feel free to steal this, right? And use this as a mantra and try it. So I was taught this when I was coming up as an emergency doctor, and I was taught it from folks that had been in the military. So it's borrowed initially from the military. And the mantra is, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Right? So the idea is that what that patient really needs is for you to get this correct. And they need for you to get it correct the first time. Right? So you can imagine here you're you're putting a central line in or something, and it's bloody and slippery, and the person is really sick, and they really need those medicines right away through it, and it's up to you to get it, and you can just feel the pressure sort of mounting as you're talking about this. And one of the steps of a central line is threading what is essentially like a 3 millimeter wire through a 4 millimeter receptor. And that's really tiny when your gloves are bloody and everything's sort of moving around all at once. So if you have to get that right, one of the things you could try saying to yourself in that moment is, all right, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I'm going to slow down consciously. I'm going to slow my breathing. I'm going to slow my hands. I'm going to slow my mind. And in doing that, I am more likely to succeed at the task and therefore honestly faster at the whole process. So it's a great one to try. Try it in a low wedge place before you end up using it in a high wedge place. Try it when you're driving or something like that, just to get it in your head and see what it feels like.
Which is very true, I think, and not just in any, saving patients' life, but I think in everything is that sometimes we overestimate saving 2 minutes without thinking that I'm just going to get there faster, but it's only a minute faster is not going to make that much difference when you make mistakes, right? So I think I like that. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
There you go.
Yeah. And you were mentioning earlier, so that is controlling your individual level. And the next level is the team.
Right. There's so much to talk about for the team. And so my primary role these days is as the chief medical officer of the Mission Critical Team Institute. Right. So we're an applied research organization, or a think tank, if you like, that was spun up at the request of a lot of the Allied Special Forces. We work with NASA and fire departments and medical groups and a lot of the space programs. And we do this because the art of having a small group of people perform in complex, rapidly adaptive systems, whether that's fire, space, medicine, military, whatever, is really challenging, right? But we know some things about it when we cross those different groups' experiences together, okay? So one thing that we can learn from this is that there's a difference between teams that have operated together for long periods of time and have history and culture, and teams that are brought together at the point of impact to try to figure something out. So we can create this spectrum of teams. So on one end, you have what's called an intact team. And that's a team like a sports team, like a basketball team, right? You are selected to play on the basketball team. You put on a jersey. Everybody knows they're part of the team. They practice together. They perform together. They go to barbecues at each other's houses. They have a team culture. And most of the time when we think about a team, that's the model we get in our head, right? But what happens in medicine is really different. In medicine, we use something that's called a swarm team often. So if you imagine what happens in a hospital when somebody hits the code blue button, right? Who responds to that? Well, we know we have a big problem. And what happens is folks from all over the hospital, from different tribes, from different cultures, from different groups within the hospital, drop what they're doing and they run to that room. And when they get there, they have to self-assemble into a team, create their own microculture, work the problem. And then when they've worked the problem, they usually disperse back to wherever they were in the hospital. So unlike the basketball team, the intact team, these folks don't really have a team identity when they start the day. They might not have even known each other. They might have never met, right? They might all show up and be figuring out, wait, are you in charge? Am I in charge? Is Christine running this? Is Dan? What's happening here? So you have this self-assembly, rapid problem-solving team that's really temporary in nature, a swarm team. And that's really functionally different than the basketball team that exists all the time. So a first step is looking at how your organization actually responds to crisis and to emergency, and asking, well, what do we use? Are we using intact teams? Are we using swarm teams? Or are we using, there's some other stuff in the middle that we'll skip over, but there's other ideas, right? And making sure that you have a really conscious model of what you're operating with. Because if you try to apply stuff from basketball teams to cardiac arrest teams, it's only going to go so far, because the realities are really, really different. So I'm happy to take that however you want. We can talk about systems for either of those groups. We can talk about what's between, what's useful.
Let's start with the intact team.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, is there something about the swarm team that that they can learn from one another?
Oh, sure.
I think it would be really interesting to see the two different approach.
Absolutely. So let's do this. So one of the things that we can poke at with intact teams is something you can call the meta conversation, right? So imagine you and I are on an intact team. We're we're operating together in one form or another, and whatever our role is in our businesses. And we say, okay, well, how do we get better tomorrow than we are today? Well, we're going to run into certain types of decisions we have to make. And we're going to have to talk to each other as we make those decisions. Now, this could be in medicine. Should we admit a patient or not? Or, should we buy this company or whatever it is? And one of the things intact teams do when they're operating at really high levels is they set some guidelines for how they will respond under pressure. All right. So a gentleman I've worked with before in the Canadian SWAT team talks about it this way. His team, when they get together to run an operation, they decide at the beginning, is this a 51% decision or a 110% decision? In other words, are we playing a game where when we reach 51% certainty, we should go full bore? Or is this a game where we need to wait until we are beyond certain and before we act? All right. So can we have this conversation ahead of time, you and I, and sit down and say, all right, when we make this caliber of decision, we're going to wait till we reach this level of certainty. Now, what's more important here is not what we pick, but that we pick the same thing, that we know we're playing the same game, right? That type of meta decision, that sort of superseding decision, allows us to make sure that we're on the same page, we're using the same skill sets, and that we're able to actually discuss that well. So intact teams are really good at this because they have longevity. They can set up ahead of time. Here's how we'll talk about it when we get there. Then they'll do it. Then they'll reflect on it and say, well, did that work? Okay, yes or no. All right, well, should we change it? Okay, we'll change it. Now, next time we're going to do it this way. And they have that institutional memory and individual memory that allows them to operate that. Swarm teams are harder because you and I might never meet beforehand if we're going to operate on a swarm team together, right? So somebody else has to sit down and say, all right, here's the general operating principle. Christine comes from anesthesia. Dan comes from medicine. Therefore, when we enter a room, on average, anesthesia will run the show and medicine will defer or whatever. Okay, cool. So that allows us to have at least the first step decided so that when we run into that room, we can help negotiate our universe. We can self-assemble. And instead of saying, hey, how are you? What's going on? Should you run this? Should I run this? Mm-hmm. We're able to run in the room. You say, I'm anesthesia. And then I say, I'm medicine. Okay, great. You're in charge. All right. Mm-hmm. We've established ahead of time what the average pattern will be for that. There's a lot in there. I think the underlying concept is when you know that there will be opportunities for applying knowledge under pressure, can you set the groundwork ahead of time, intact or swarm, and help your team succeed at that moment?
Is there a moment where for the swarm team, the intact team, and majority of people who are not in medicine probably are more in the intact team, right? Is there some aspect of the swarm team that can be really helpful for the team on the intact team to learn from, or just completely separate?
No, I think any team can learn from any other team when you think through how you would do it, right? So one sort of system you could think about if you are on an intact team is, what would it look like if we were forced to rebuild it from first principles? All right. So right now we have a culture, we have a system, we have a way of operating under pressure. And most of the time we're doing that and tweaking that. If we were a swarm team and we had to come together from scratch to operate again in this problem set, what would we do differently? And I think that discipline of saying, let's pretend we don't know each other and see what happens is actually pretty useful. Mm-hmm. It can blur into, say, a pre-mortem where you're trying to figure out what will go wrong in a problem set. You could imagine using that as a post hoc analysis in sort of a morbidity and mortality setting if you're really trying to digest what happened in a space. But I think there's utility in almost pretending you're a swarm team and sort of seeing what happens with that.
I think it's a good exercise because I think sometimes, like what you're saying, it's a trained skill. So maybe I think if you pretend like you're a swarm team, you kind of see different characters that we learn from one another. I wonder.
Yeah, absolutely. It also tends to shake up who's in charge, right? When you self-organize into a group, there's lots of different configurations you can end up with. So it gives people a chance to lead and a chance to understand what they're good and less good at pretty dynamically and pretty naturally, as opposed to we've always done it this way and here's how we're going to keep doing it.
And then the third piece is the enterprise.
The system.
The system.
Yeah.
How many of our listeners are founders and they're, in charge of the whole company. And how can they organize so that they can handle challenging situations and move the direction that slow, smooth, fast?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great question, right? So there are organizational shapes and structures that are more or less resilient to crisis and that are able to deploy knowledge differently under pressure, right? So one thing we see in the hospital, and I'll take it back out of the hospital in a second, is that we have a very tribal and tribalistic sort of culture, right? So anesthesia is different than pediatrics. Pediatrics is different than medicine. Doctors are a little different than nurses and respiratory therapists. And there's different cultures that come with that. So the different tribes, for lack of a better word, dress differently, act differently, tell different types of jokes, and have different sort of settings of what's appropriate when they behave in certain ways. Most of the time when we need to operate in medicine, though, we're operating across the boundaries of those groups. So we're forcing people to not just interact with people that are exactly like them, but to create cognitively diverse teams that smash together groups of different expertise. So if you're the leading of a system and you know your system has multiple teams and these teams are going to have to work together, this sounds frighteningly obvious, but we get it wrong in medicine a lot, is that you should create bridges between the teams. Right? You should have people sit down and get to know each other as human beings and have exposure to each other and try to identify the pain points where things are going to go wrong ahead of time. Right? So if you know that on the weekends, it's really hard for emergency doctors and trauma doctors to find somebody from the blood bank to access a certain type of blood product or something, right? You can try to sit down ahead of time and say, all right, well, let's game this out. Let's run a simulation, a low wedge thing, where we run the scenario and see what happens and how we can fix it. And just by increasing the contact between those groups, you can do a lot for making them more like people and less like some other person in some other space. The converse of that is, of course, to ask the people on the front line what's actually going on, right? What are you struggling with? So if I'm the head of a big system, if you put me in charge of a new hospital right now, right, one of the first things I would do is I would go to the ER, not just because I love the ER, because I do, but just in general, and you'd go to the hospital ward and go to the surgery, the ORs, and you'd say, all right, what are you struggling with? What's going on? Where are the places where our system is falling apart and what can we do about it? And again, that's not rocket science. Lots of folks are doing that. One of the best versions of this I've learned, though, came from a woman I was learning from who's the head of a big thing in the oil and gas industry and taught me to ask a very specific question, which is not just what are you struggling with, but if your team was worse than it is now, your team's very good. But if your team was a little worse, what might they struggle with? Right? And doing that allows folks to imagine a little bit, to put down some of their ego and to say, okay, well, here's some stuff that we might struggle with if we were a little worse. It opens up a lot of these conversations and especially doubling down between those two ideas, right? Okay, well, this team's going to tell me what they're struggling with. I'm going to go out and find out the inter-team relationships that help solve that problem. I'm going to build some low-wedge models to help everybody practice. We're going to run it out and we're going to look ahead at what's going to happen. The thread between all of these ideas, right, that really connects introception and learning how a person responds under pressure, different team models for response, and then the systems level, what do we do to make things work better, right, is trying to take the idea that applying knowledge under pressure is really hard, right? It's just really hard. So what can we do now to set ourselves up for success ahead of time? Most of the time, that means understanding the situation we're going to have to apply knowledge, building a lower wedge model of it, and breaking something cheaply and easily before we have to deploy it in the real life settings.
Yeah. And do you think a lot of organization does that exercise, or oftentimes they're so busy and don't really think about it until like, dang.
Yeah, I think there are organizations that are doing it. Sometimes because they have to, because the cost of not doing it is really high. Sometimes because the probability of a failure at a particular point is really high. And sometimes because they're more, let's just call it enlightened, and have thought ahead more about, hey, I really want something to go right. So what happens if it doesn't? Right? So you have the whole subclass of high reliability organizations where things have to go a certain way. Aircraft carriers, nuclear power plants, operating rooms, things where the cost of failure is extraordinarily high. And in order to make that failure to zero, you really have to play ahead with a lot of these pieces of it. So I think that's one group. One way to ask this would be, maybe you don't have to develop an entire sim center, an entire red team environment, an entire culture of testing everything. But in your organization, where are you likely to fail? Or put another way, where are you likely to have to apply knowledge under pressure? And what is a simple thing you can do to get your organization more ready to apply knowledge under pressure at that one point? Right? There are lots of cheap and easy ways to move forward in that direction. A very simple first order thing is just literally asking the people that have to work there, where are we going to struggle here? Put your mind ahead of time. Imagine we're failing. What is it going to look like? You're going to find a ton of stuff in there that you can start drilling and start working on.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's obviously a lot of other resources if you want to push farther, if you want to build red teams or simulation systems or what have you.
Yeah, no, this is great. On the lighter note, I know we're out of time.
Yeah.
For somebody is listening who is, we all like to say that, oh, I can handle stress. I mean, so your tool that I think is really helpful. And sometimes people don't realize that they're under stress, and then their health take a toll. And how do you remind yourself, and knowing that how do you be self-aware and be connected about, where you are in that curve?
So what I said a minute ago about systems, right? Looking ahead at where you're likely to fail and running tests and experiments in that area, getting really curious about what happens, and then putting in systems to make that better. That's my exact answer to this too, right? So one of the things you see in medicine, particularly in emergency care or shift work, is you see a lot of friction when you leave the hospital environment and come home, right? That's just because you're having different worlds that are sort of colliding with each other in that moment. So if I believe that's a place where I might struggle, right? And that's not just me. I think that's most folks in that space. Then what can I run experiments in that one moment that'll set me up for success better? And so one of the things that I personally do there is I try to park in a space that makes me walk substantially between where my car is and where the front door of the ER is, right? And I do that on purpose. If I can, I go through a bridge or a tunnel or whatever, just because that's easier for me as a visual boundary. But as I'm doing that, I put in my mind, I imagine some signposts on the way in and some signposts on the way out. And these are the signposts that are going to help me to remember to put the medicine down and go back to being Dan the human on the way out. And it's simple. It's not particularly hard to do. But if you think ahead about where you might struggle and try to create a line that allows you to succeed, that makes it more likely for you to succeed, you'll find a lot of things in there.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great tip. Well, thank you very much for your time and your insight. I learned a lot from this conversation today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you, and I hope the folks listening get a lot out of it.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Health Technology Podcast.
We hope you found the conversation insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us continue bringing you the latest in health innovation. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn and Twitter for updates on upcoming episodes and more. Until next time, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in healthcare. I'm Christine Minato, and thank you for listening.